"Sir, I'm going to need you to remove the medals." The voice was not unkind. That was perhaps the most particular thing about it, not unkind, and not entirely comfortable with what it was doing, which was addressing an 89-year-old man in a dark suit on a public sidewalk on Memorial Day morning in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in front of the Veterans Memorial outside the Cumberland County Courthouse, which was where Raymond Chester Polk had been standing for 23 minutes without incident when the MP arrived. Memorial Day in Fayetteville is not a casual occasion. The city has the highest per capita concentration of active duty and veteran military personnel of any city in the country. Fort Liberty's 100,000 soldiers and their families. The retired community that clusters in the surrounding counties. The families who put down roots near the base decades ago and stayed after the service member separated. On Memorial Day, the courthouse square fills in the early morning with people who are not there for ceremony, but for something more serious than ceremony, for the actual reckoning of loss. There are flags, and there are flowers, and there is a particular quality of silence around the stone names that is not the silence of solemnity, but the silence of proximity to the real thing. Raymond had been coming to this square on Memorial Day for 27 years. He stood in the same spot every year, off to the side of the central memorial, in the shade of the oak that had been there longer than the building behind it, in a position from which he could see the names on the wall without being immediately visible to the main crowd. He was not there to be seen. He had never been there to be seen. The MP's name was Corporal Luis Sandoval, 25 years old, 2 years into his posting, and he had been responding to a call from a civilian who had photographed the old man's medals and posted them in an online veterans group with the caption, "Can anyone ID these? I served 8 years and I've never seen this combination." The responses in the group had arrived quickly and in volume, and their general consensus was that the combination of decorations on the old man's chest was inconsistent with any verifiable service record, which was the phrase the group had settled on, and which translated into simpler language as, "This man is lying about what he did." Sandoval had looked at the photograph. He had looked at the man on the sidewalk he had approached. The old man looked at him now with a quality of patience that was not passive. It was the patience of a man who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has recognized, in the way that you recognize the approach of weather you've tracked before, that it has finally arrived. His name was Raymond Chester Polk. He was 89 years old. He was wearing a suit that had been pressed with the care of someone who understands that the suit is a statement even when no one acknowledges that it is. Dark charcoal, recently dry cleaned. The kind of suit a man brings out for occasions that require him to be precise about his respect for them. On the left breast of the jacket he wore 7 medals on their service ribbons, arranged in the prescribed order of military precedence, each one correct in its placement, and each one catching the May morning light in a way that had attracted a photograph and a question and, ultimately, a young MP's careful voice on a Memorial Day sidewalk. Raymond did not remove the medals. He looked at Sandoval. His eyes were brown, a deep, particular brown. Not dark exactly, but dense. The kind of brown that has had a great many things pass through it and has retained all of them. He was not a large man, 5'7", the slight forward tilt in his posture of someone whose spine has carried significant weight across 9 decades and is negotiating the terms of that weight in its own way. His hands, clasped in front of him, were the most contradictory thing about him. Enormous for a man of his size. With the kind of stillness that is not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of systems that have been trained to absolute precision, and that carry that precision even now, even at rest, even at 89. "Son," he said, in a voice that was gravel and patience and something else underneath both of those things, something that was not going to explain itself to anyone who hadn't earned the right to the explanation. These medals were issued to me by the United States government. I didn't take them from anyone. Sir, I understand that. But we've had a concern raised about the combination of decorations, and I'm going to need to verify. I know why you're here, Raymond said. He said it without heat, without the indignation of a man who feels wrongly accused. He said it with the flat accuracy of a man who has done the calculation and arrived at a known result. This has happened before. Sandoval's notepad was open. Sir, can you provide your service number? Raymond provided it. Sandoval typed it into the tablet on his belt. He waited. The result that came back was not what he was expecting, not a record, not a file, not the standard biographical data of a veteran's service history. What came back was a single line: access restricted. Request must be routed through JAG office, installation commander. Sandoval looked at the screen. He looked at the old man. He looked at the screen again, with the expression of someone who has pulled a thread and found that what's attached to it is larger and more tangled than the thread suggested. He called for backup. The two civilian officers who arrived were not unkind either. That, again, was the specific quality of the morning. Everyone involved doing a job they had been assigned, none of them doing it with malice, all of them doing it in a way that was nonetheless incorrect, in a manner that would require the rest of the day to address. The officers spoke to Raymond with the careful, slightly over-enunciated courtesy that is extended to elderly people when the person extending it is uncertain about what they are dealing with and wants to leave as few openings as possible. They asked him to surrender his identification. He did. They asked him to accompany them to the station. He did. He had, as he had said, been through this before. In the back of the vehicle, the cuffs that they placed on his wrists, standard procedure, they said, and he nodded because he had heard this before, were cold. The metal was cold, in the particular way of restraints that have been on a belt in the morning air. And the cold traveled up his wrists and into his forearms, and the cold was not painful, and it was not humiliating, and it was the trigger for something that was neither of those things either. The smell of the patrol vehicle, vinyl and antiseptic, and the distant ghost of fast food went away. What came back was the smell of a processing facility in Seoul, South Korea, in December of 1952, when he was 18 years old and had been in country for 11 days. The facility was not a comfortable place, and the smells were not comfortable smells. And the restraints on his wrists then had been less standard and more emphatic. And the reason for them had not been a misunderstanding about metals, but a misunderstanding about identity, which was a different thing and had taken longer to resolve. He had been there with 3 other men who were also not who the paperwork said they were, because they had been inserted with paperwork that said they were not who they were, and the resolution, when it came 3 days later, had arrived in the form of a man he never saw again, who walked into the facility, spoke to 2 people for 90 seconds, and walked out, and then the 4 of them walked out behind him. The man had not explained himself. He had not apologized. He had simply resolved the situation in the way that certain people resolve situations, by being present and knowing what to do. Raymond had thought about that man a great many times in the subsequent 71 years. He had thought about him more in the last decade than in any previous one, for reasons he could not have articulated if asked, but that had something to do with time becoming, at a certain age, not longer but more transparent, so that the distances between decades collapsed and what was far became close. He thought about him now, in the back of the vehicle, with the cold of the cuffs on his wrists. He had never been afraid of restraints. He had learned at 18 in a facility in Seoul that restraints were a temporary condition of a situation that was itself temporary, and that the correct response to them was patience, and that patience was not passive, it was the active choice to not spend your energy on what you could not change, so that it was available for what you could. He had 7 medals on his chest. All of them had been issued to him by the United States government. 3 of them could not be found in any publicly available record, not because they did not exist, but because the records in which they existed required a clearance level that was shared by a small number of people in the country, and had been for 60 years, and would be, if Raymond understood anything about institutional inertia, for the foreseeable future. He was used to being a thing that could not be explained in the systems that tried to look him up. At the station, the desk sergeant ran the service number and received the same single line as Sandoval, access restricted. Request must be routed through JAG office, installation commander. The sergeant looked at it for a moment, and then, because he was thorough and because he had been at this desk long enough to know that certain results required escalation rather than assumption, he picked up the phone. The call that went out from the Cumberland County Law Enforcement Center at 10:43 on Memorial Day morning arrived through a routing that took 22 minutes and involved 4 people who each did some version of stopping what they were doing upon encountering a specific combination of information. At the office of Brigadier General Francis Alton, Army Reserve Command, Fort Liberty. Alton was 56 years old, trim and direct, a woman who had spent 3 decades learning to read the operational landscape, and who, when the call reached her and she heard the service number and the clearance flag and the charge, stolen Valor, civilian custody, Fayetteville, said nothing for a moment in the way that generals say nothing when they are computing something that requires computation. Then she said, "Give me the address. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 31. Raymond was in a standard interview room, not a cell, because the officers had concluded, once the nature of the clearance flag became apparent, that a standard interview room was the appropriate interim arrangement. The room had a metal table and 4 chairs and a large window through which she could see him before she entered. She spent 45 seconds at the window. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table. Not restrained, the cuffs had been removed when he was brought to the room, standard procedure, and he had nodded when they were removed the same way he had nodded when they were applied. He was sitting with the quality of someone who has been in rooms like this before, and who is not troubled by them. Not because he has no regard for his own freedom, but because he has a long experience of confined spaces and the patience that comes from having survived their equivalent in a great many less comfortable contexts. His suit was still pressed. The medals were still on his chest. He was looking at nothing in particular, and he was entirely present. Alton entered the room. She had spent the 31-minute drive on a secure call, and she had learned what she could learn, which was not everything, and was more than most people would ever know. The service number attached to Raymond Chester Polk returned files at 2 classification levels. The first level she was cleared to view. It gave her the broad outlines: enlistment, 1951, service through 1971, multiple theaters, unit designations that were familiar to her as a general officer and that would not have been familiar to anyone without her specific background and clearance. The designations told her what kind of operations the man had been attached to. They told her the geographic range. They told her, in the language that certain file notations use to communicate things that cannot be written plainly, that this was a man who had done work in places and for purposes that the Army, during that era, had considered too sensitive for standard documentation. The second level she was not cleared to view. She knew that it existed. She could see it the way you can see a door in a wall, its outline, its presence, its clear implication that something is on the other side, without being able to open it. She knew what the classification level was. She knew what kind of operations generated records at that classification level. because those operations were part of the institutional history that general officers were required to understand even when the specifics were sealed. She did not know what Raymond Chester Polk had specifically done in the years for which no unclassified record existed. She knew that the medals on his chest corresponded to what was in the files at both levels. She knew this because she had spent 17 minutes on the secure call with a man at the Pentagon who had the clearance she did not have, and who had said, when she read him the decorations, "Every one of those is in the record. Some of them are in the record she can see. Some of them are in the record she cannot. But every one is there." She sat down across from him. He looked at her with those dense brown eyes. "Mr. Polk," she said. "I'm Brigadier General Francis Alton. I've had the charges dismissed. You're free to go." Raymond said nothing. He looked at her steadily. There was nothing in his look that asked for an apology or an explanation or any form of restoration of dignity, because his dignity had not been affected by the morning's events, not, Alton realized as she sat across from him, because he was indifferent to what had happened, but because his sense of what he was did not require external verification to remain intact. It had not required it for a very long time. "I've seen as much of your record as I'm cleared to see," she said. "I want you to know that She stopped, in the way that people stop when what they are about to say is reaching for something larger than their language is quite built for. "I understand that there are things in your record that I can't see. I understand what that means. What it cost, not just the service itself, the silence afterward, the being unable to say what you did, or why you did it, or what it cost the people around you." She paused. She looked at the medals on his chest, and then at his face. These men in that online group. They weren't wrong to ask the question. They just didn't know what they were asking about. She put her hands flat on the table. "I'd like to shake your hand, if that's all right with you." Raymond looked at the hand on the table for a moment. He appeared to be conducting some internal assessment, the nature of which he did not disclose. His face held the particular expression of someone deciding something that they have already decided but want to decide correctly. Then he extended his right hand. She shook it. "I was going to the cemetery," Raymond said. His voice was level. "When they stopped me. I go every Memorial Day. There are 11 names I visit." "I know," she said. She didn't know the names. She knew there were names. "We'll have someone drive you." "I'll drive myself," he said. He stood, slowly, with the economy of movement of a man who has learned to move carefully without allowing the carefulness to become hesitation. He straightened his jacket. He checked the alignment of the medals with one brief, precise touch. "That's where I was going." She walked him out. At the door of the station, in the May morning light, the same officers who had arrested him were standing in the corridor, and they watched him walk out the door with the particular attention of people who have understood in the last 90 minutes that they are in the presence of something they did not anticipate and do not entirely know how to account for. Raymond did not look at them when he passed. Not from contempt. Contempt was not a thing he spent much energy on. He simply had somewhere he was going, and the getting there was what mattered. His car was in the courthouse parking lot where he had left it. He got in. He adjusted the mirror. He put the key in the ignition, and the engine turned over with the reliable sound of a car that is maintained the way things get maintained when the person doing the maintaining does not believe in letting things that work stop working. He pulled out of the parking lot. 11 minutes later, he was at the cemetery. He parked. He got out. He walked, slowly, with the deliberate economy of his years, with the morning light on the dark suit and the medals and the white of his hair, to the section where 11 names were arranged on stone markers in a row that he could have found in the dark. because he had found it in a kind of dark for 60 years. The particular darkness of outliving the people whose names you carry. He knew the names the way you know the names of things that are not separate from you. Not by memory, exactly. Memory implies a distance between the person and the thing remembered, and for Raymond that distance did not exist. The names were not inscribed somewhere in his mind. They were structural. They were part of what he was made of. The way certain experiences become not things you have had, but things you are. He stood in front of the first marker for a long time. He did not speak. He had never spoken at the markers, because what needed to be said between him and these men had been said in other places, at other times, in conditions that did not permit language anyway, and that had produced instead a different kind of understanding. One that was not verbal, and not ritual, and not anything that an observer could have identified and named. He simply stood, and he was present, and the presence was the thing. The names were in the order he visited them: Graves, Thibodeau, Park, Okonkwo, Ramrez, Lindqvist, Al-Rashidi, Beaumont, Chen, Delgado, Morrison, 11 men. They had been, respectively, 21, 23, 19, 24, 22, 20, 25, 20, 23, 21, and 22 years old. He had known each of them in the specific way that people know each other. When they have been in situations where the normal boundaries of privacy are suspended by circumstance and what you know about a person is not the curated version they would present in any other context but the actual version, what they are afraid of, what they cannot stop thinking about, what they want if they make it home. They had not made it home. He had. He had carried this fact, not as guilt exactly, but as a kind of obligation, for 60 years. It was not a weight he wanted to put down. It was the weight that told him who he was and what he owed and to whom. He had come to this cemetery for the first time at age 28, 9 years after the last of the 11 had died, and he had stood in front of the markers and had understood, for the first time fully and without softening, what 60 years of visiting would feel like. He had come every year since. He had not missed a year. He stood for 45 minutes. He moved from marker to marker with the unhurried care of a man for whom this is the central appointment of the year and who wants to give it what it deserves. He did not look at his watch. He did not need to. The time passed the way it always passed here, differently than it passed anywhere else, with a particular density and texture, with the feeling of being actually used rather than simply elapsed. When he reached the last marker, Morrison, 22 years old, the youngest, the one whose mother Raymond had visited twice in the subsequent years until she died, he stood for a while longer than at the others. He did not know why this had always been true. It simply had. Then he walked back to his car. He got in. He adjusted the mirror with the same careful habitual movement. He put the key in the ignition and the engine turned over. He drove home. He had been going to the cemetery. He had been stopped. He had been put in a room with his hands on a table. He had shaken a general's hand. He had driven 11 minutes. He had stood for 45 minutes in front of 11 names. He had done what he came to do. There are men whose service was so important and so dangerous and so far outside the normal categories of military documentation that the record of what they did will outlive everyone who could read it. They did not do what they did for the record. They did it because it was the thing that needed doing, and they were the ones who could do it. They are very old now, and some of them wear their medals in public on the days when it seems right to wear them, and sometimes someone takes a photograph and asks a question, and the systems that try to answer the question cannot, because the answer is inside a classification level that most people will never have, and that most people will never need. They do not explain themselves. They go to the cemetery, and they stand for a while, and they drive home. That is enough. That has always been enough. If this story moved you, if you believe that the men and women who served in the shadows deserve to be seen, even by the few who can, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Veterans Valor, where every story is a reminder that the ones who say the least are often the ones who gave the most.